I want to tell you that when Mahler was 8 years old, his father took him on a walk in the woods and told him to sit and wait. He had something to take care of, and then he forgot about him. For 4 hours. He was 8 years old, and he was forgotten about for 4 hours. And when the father remembered and came running back to find him, he found him in exactly the same place, sitting on the same log, listening to the sounds of nature. He was preparing to write his first symphony. And he had a perfect ear, and he took all the sounds of the forest, the birds, and all the sounds that he heard, the sound of the trumpets and the barracks close by, and he wrote them into his first symphony. When you do the Mahler 5, you have to put something before it. It's not long enough for a whole evening. So some of the Mahler symphonies last the whole evening. Next year we're going to do the third symphony, and here it lasts more than a whole evening. But this is too short. So you have to put something. The tradition is a Mozart piano concerto or something of that kind. But I thought, what a wonderful idea to play a piece that was written at exactly the same time, same year, right? Two musicians who, each of them had a tremendous effect on the world, and incidentally, both composers who composed only as a hobby. Mahler was a conductor. Ives was an insurance agent, and a very, very successful one. But they both composed privately, and both had a profound effect on music and even on society. They almost met, and they're meeting tonight, so I'm very happy about that. So that brings us to the Mahler Fifth Symphony, and I should have an hour to tell you something of which I have almost no time, but I'm going to ask you to listen to certain things. There's a gentleman I met yesterday who was tending my garden, and I asked him if he'd like to come to the concert. Yes, he was come, and with a friend. And had you ever been to a concert? No, he's never heard a symphony orchestra. So imagine the first time you hear a symphony or Mahler 5 in Symphony Hall. I mean, incredible to imagine. So there's a huge orchestra, gigantic orchestra, but it's played almost all the time like a chamber orchestra. It very rarely plays all together, and it is one of the high points in the life of musicians to play this piece. Every trumpeter dreams of playing the Mahler 5, and we've invited back to play the first trumpet part Jeffrey Work, who was our first trumpeter for 13 years, and then 13 years ago he went off to be the first trumpet in Oregon, and he's come back to play with us, and you will be amazed. And it is the biggest horn part in the entire repertoire. And Kevin Owen, who's our first horn player, has been our first horn player for 37 years. It's a very long time. And it's the biggest piece in the repertoire for the horn. And it's an amazing experience for the harpist, but for all the instruments. For the percussion, oh my God, it's just incredible. And orchestras love to play this music. And so it's a wonderful experience just on that level. Now I want to talk about the next thing, which is the structure of the piece. I've given you a little bit of an idea how the Ives is structured. The Mahler is structured in a very simple way, although it seems incredibly complicated. And Mahler thought that nobody would be able to understand his music. He said, if only my symphony could be premiered 50 years from now, people won't be able to make head or tail of it. Well, actually, it's not that difficult. The first two movements are stuck together like this. The first two movements, dark, tragic movements, they last approximately 26 minutes. That's the first two. The last two also belong together. The Adagietto and the final movement also last about 26 minutes. And in between, there's a scherzo which lasts 18 minutes. Okay? So that's the structure. You've got two huge pillars, and in the middle, the third movement. Now, the first movement and the second movement are dark and tragic and anguished and bleak and full of sadness and protest and despair. Also, they are full of collapse. The first trumpet builds to a great climax and then collapses and brings up and collapses. Everybody collapses. Each climax collapses in this movement. The color of the first two movements is very dark, and it's about death. And you hear the tam-tam a lot. The tam-tam was the instrument that Mahler associated with death. The last two movements are full of color and light and life. Love music, happy music, joyful, playful, rollicking, fun, humorous, absolutely the opposite of the first two movements. You get that? Dark and light, death and life. And they also last about the same length, not precisely, but approximately. And then in the middle comes the third movement, which is very powerful. It's the longest scherzo ever written, and it's ambiguous in its mood. It's ebullient and nostalgic, it's full of parody, it's full of awe, it's full of any number of different emotions. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. At the end of the second movement, that's part of the dark first couple, something extraordinary happens. There is a moment of triumph. The brass rise up in D major to a great climax. It's at one of the darkest moments in the piece. Suddenly, this brilliant, bright, shining light of the triumph of the brass at that moment, and then, of course, it collapses. And then it dies out in ghastly, ghostly mutterings. And you will say to yourself, that has to come back. That cannot be the end of that. But it is a bridge with the end of the whole piece, because it comes back at the end. And so the end of the first movement and the end of the last movement are connected by this bridge. Once you get that structure, the approximately 70 minutes of the piece actually will not present so much of a problem. You'll know your way about pretty quickly. Now, the most important thing for Mahler is the emotions. He wasn't thinking about creating a structure, he was thinking about creating emotions. The first part, the double movement, first movement, second movement, come from Mahler's own story. His life was extremely tragic. I could go into it in great detail. I cannot do that except to touch on it. He lost 7 brothers and sisters in his own childhood. Can you imagine these two girls? They had 7 siblings. It would be 7 siblings who died during his childhood. He watched the coffin coming in and out of the house. It was like part of the furniture. And he had many, many terrible experiences. His own illness led to death. His own daughter died 4 years old. He never got over that. I got a message tonight from Marina Mahler, who is his other daughter, and she sent love and greetings to the Boston Philharmonic on our celebration of our 40th anniversary. But the other child, the other girl, died when he was 4, and he never got over it. And in fact, in the end of the second movement, there's a quotation. For those who know Mahler, you'll recognize a quotation from the Kindertotenlieder, the songs of the death of children, where the mother wakes up in the morning with the dead child in her hands and says, "The sun will rise brightly for everybody except me." So like Ives, he took songs and dances from other places, and he made, and that's why he felt Ives was such a kindred spirit, because he did exactly the same thing. He burst the bounds of the symphonic structure. So what you will get in the first movement and in the second movement is an exploration of tragedy and brutality and violence and terror and all those emotions. It's a very, very extraordinary thing. I'll tell you a little bit more about it if I have time. The last movement has the famous Adagietto, and the Adagietto of Mahler is the single most famous piece of music he ever wrote. It's well known. It has been dramatically misunderstood because people thought that it was about death. And in fact, Visconti used it for Death in Venice. Bernstein played it at Robert Kennedy's funeral, and it's often played at funerals very, very slowly. And the performance, the slowest performance that I've ever heard is by a German conductor, which is, it actually lasts 15 minutes. And if you play it very slowly, it becomes about death. Mahler had something completely indifferent in mind. He wrote it as a love message to his wife-to-be, Alma, Marina's mother. And he didn't need to say anything because she was a musician too, and so she received it, read it, and said, "Oh, he loves me, great, I'll marry him." Yeah, so it was a love song, and if you play it as a love song, I love you, it's irresistible, even on this miserable piano, isn't it? So imagine with the harp and the strings and so on. It is incredibly beautiful and calls on and gets from us a great deal of rubato playing, which is freedom of timing, elasticity, the kind of thing that I believe is at the actual heart of Mahler's musical style. So that's the second movement. It builds to a huge, glorious climax, and you will see it is deeply, deeply touching. And the feeling at the end of that is one of, I don't know, I can't describe it. It's much more precise. As Mendelssohn said, music is much more precise than words. Words can't possibly describe what we feel and experience with music. Then comes the last movement, which is full of invention and energy, and it's full of joy. And so the last two movements go from sublime to the mundane, to the affirmation of life itself. It is a plethora of invention. It's like a glorification of creativity in the last movement. So you've got these two completely different pillars, and in the middle you've got the scherzo, which is from Viennese life. And what he does is he takes the Viennese waltz and plays with it. He half loved Vienna and the Viennese waltz, and he half hated Vienna because of the fact he was rejected because of anti-Semitism, and it was a very mixed relationship. There's also some very powerful, strange sounds of horns, apparently telling great stories of fairy tales. And I spend a lot of time in the rehearsals telling stories to the orchestra. I tell them about the trumpet at the beginning. I tell them that that's like a bugle boy with 2,000 dead soldiers, and he's the only one living, and he's playing. And I told them when the cello play, they're very sad, incredibly mournful. In the second movement, all alone, they play a theme which is amazing. They're completely. Oh, and this one. I told them that's like ravens cackling. And then the horn. A funeral march, and then there's like a Holocaust theme when the cellos come all alone. I told them it was like starving survivors of the Holocaust who hadn't seen the light for months and could barely walk and barely breathe. They were so, and you should hear them play. I mean, they conjure up these images. So what I would suggest you do is conjure up images for yourself, from your life, from your experience, from literature, from whatever you can call on, because Mahler is doing that. And I did the same thing. That's what's so amazing. So the first movement, I have to wrap up here, but the first movement is slow with a fast interlude. Start slow, and it has this theme, this very sad funereal theme, which is so characteristic of funeral music. Whenever you hear this rhythm, And over that he writes piangendo, crying. And if you think it sounds Jewish, you're absolutely right. And I tell them, be a little more Jewish, you know. Very few of them are Jewish. It's very sad. It's funny, the only time I didn't have any difficulty conducting this piece was in Israel. I didn't even have to say anything. They knew exactly. Anyway, so there is one extraordinary moment. I wish I could describe it. It's after that cello solo, immediately after the cello solo, where the cellos play so softly. And there's an extraordinary moment in which the horns, first of all, play that the funeral march, and then the cackling ravens in the top, and then the violin goes to and the cellos. There are 6 completely different things, different emotions at the same time. Now, there is no other composer who does that. There are many composers who have lots of themes, lots of polyphony, many voices. Beethoven, my God, he can have 7 voices going simultaneously. But what Mahler does, he has 7 characters going simultaneously. I call that emotional polyphony. That's when you're drawn in all directions and you have to take in all these emotions simultaneously, like reading a novel. And it is very much like that. And so I recommend you enter that Mahler world. And then in the third movement, you can imagine playing in a Viennese cafe, you know, just a little group playing waltzes. And then as the piece goes on towards the end, the music is whisked into a frenzy at the end of the movement of chaos and terror. You might think the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire is being described. The waltz becomes like a frenetic dance of death. But we know that something very deeply serious has taken over what was intended to be charming, elegant, and sophisticated. Now, the question that I leave you with, and it is right at the end of our time together, and as you probably can tell, I've been rushing to get through. I have a recording on the website, on the Benjamin Zander website, in which I describe this symphony at great length with examples, and it's on there. It's the discussion disc that was put together for the recording of the Mahler Fifth with the Philharmonia Orchestra. And if you take time someday to listen to the whole thing, you'll hear all the references and so on. I can only touch on it today, but I'll leave you with this thought. There is a natural instinct that we all have to reconcile different experiences, and every sitcom depends on our desire to do that, which is why they all end happily. But an artist like Mahler can challenge that and break through the addiction to make everything come out right and make sense of every experience and of every trauma. And Mahler teaches us something very important. He tells us he tells it like it is. The dark experience at the beginning and the love and joy at the end coexist in Mahler's world. It doesn't mean that the dark experience has disappeared. It's too powerful anyway. You can't get it out of your head. It's so powerful. Those 26 minutes are just overwhelmingly intense. How can you forget about them just because the music has become cheerful? So when the chorale, you remember the famous D major chorale that came at the end of the second movement, you think that is a moment of tremendous triumph. When it comes back, it doesn't lead to glory and triumph. Now, there are some Mahler symphonies that do, like the final end of the Third Symphony and the final end of the Second Symphony. But the Fifth Symphony is going into a different world. This is a more modern world. It's 1901, same year as Ives wrote his symphony, and they were both exploring the modern era. And the two worlds are disparate and remain separate. And I think it asks something different of us as listeners. It asks us to stand in the face of disparate experiences as in the face of different truths. unreconciled. That's the way I feel about this symphony. And when you hear a piece of music, and look around how many people are in this room who've been exploring it with me together before you hear it, and you hear it with 2,000 other people as you will this evening, it puts people into a state of connectedness that only great works of music can do. And it can give us a courage to be with the truth. I feel that about the modern idiom, and this piece in particular. And from it emerges the next step. Remember, Mahler was exactly at the midpoint of his creative life. 5 symphonies, 5 to go. 4 complete and 1 incomplete. So there's a long way to go. And so all I ask of you is to listen, even the people who've never, you know the young gentleman I told you who's never been to hear a symphony before? This is his first one. Can you imagine? I mean, it's mind-blowing. So I say to him and to all of you, listen with everything you have. Listen with your heart, especially your heart. And Mahler's message is spoken through this great orchestra. And if you listen with I don't mean the specific orchestra, through the orchestra. He uses every resource that the orchestra has to offer in order to give his message. And you will hear what he has to say if you listen with all your heart. And the more you hear, the more you'll get. It's the way it is. And the more you've experienced, the more you will be able to experience when you listen to the music. That's the beauty of these works. We come back to them again and again because each time we bring more of ourself and more of our listening.